Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. The Razer Edge has been out for about a year and a half at this point, and so I think it's time to do an updated review. And this thing has always been a little bit strange when it comes to handhelds. It's essentially just a small AMOLED tablet that's connected together with a Razer Kishi controller. And while it does have a couple great features, including an excellent processor as well as good battery life, it also has a couple negative aspects as well, including a wide aspect ratio that doesn't work very well with retro gaming, and the initial launch price was $400. Well, today some of those aspects have changed, most especially the price. You can now find it for $250 regularly on Amazon, and I've seen it on sale a bunch for around $200. And I think that price point alone makes it worth talking about again. In addition, there have been quite a few changes on the software side, both from Razer, but then also just the Android community in general. And finally, over the past month or so that I've been retesting this device, I've come away with a different perspective that I think is worth sharing as well. And so grab a snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we get started, let's go over the things that I liked and I didn't like in my initial review of the Razer Edge. And the first thing that was pretty impressive back then is the amount of features that you get for that $400 retail price. It came with the Snapdragon G3X Gen 1, which is essentially a Snapdragon 888, and that is a very decent chipset when it comes to both Android gaming as well as emulation. The display on the device is not bad either. It's AMOLED with a 1080p resolution, although it is a wider 20:9 aspect ratio. Then it also has a 144 Hz refresh rate. Now just bear in mind that refresh rate is only going to apply when it comes to games that can support it. It's not really going to be a thing when it comes to emulation. It also has a decent battery size, 5,000 milliamp hours. I get an average between 6 and 8 hours of gameplay depending on how hard I'm pushing it. And finally, the other thing that kind of stood out to me is the fact that it came with the Razer Kishi V2, but an upgraded version with better haptics and a headphone jack. And this controller at the time was a pretty great deal given the fact that it was going for around $80 to $100, although now you can find it for about $60. Now on the negative sides, there were a couple things worth discussing. The first was that wider aspect ratio like I mentioned before. And the aspect ratio is very similar to what you would find in a modern smartphone. In fact, I think they probably just used a modern smartphone screen to actually make this tablet. And there are a couple examples where this will be totally awesome. For example, when watching a modern movie, it usually has a wider aspect ratio, and then also most Android games will scale to the full screen as well. And when playing 16:9 content, for example, streaming modern games or playing a more modern system like Switch or PSP, all these are going to look great too. The issue really comes when you start to try to play things like 4:3. It just makes those black bezels on the left and right pretty egregious. And so I've never found this device to be a great fit when it comes to retro gaming. For example, I just would not ever play a Game Boy game on this device. In addition, at the time of launch, I felt like the software was unfinished. There were a bunch of features that they said were going to be coming in a later update. And I also felt like the overall Android platform felt a little bit limited even 18 months ago. Nowadays, we have additional and updated emulators and drivers and even front ends that can really enhance that experience. And then finally, the other criticism I had about the Razer Edge is that the whole thing just felt a little bit cobbled together. A lot of this just had to do with the Razer Kishi controller itself, and it's not a very sturdy controller. And so compared to like a dedicated handheld, this always felt to be a little bit more piecemeal. And I think when you put that all together, when you compare it against its price point, this is a device that didn't make a lot of sense for me because the retail price was $400. Now the features and the chipset and everything else that you got 18 months ago for $400 was still pretty decent. However, that price point in particular was also the entry-level price of a Steam Deck. And even though there are a lot of factors that separate these two between the OS and size and everything else, the fact that they cost the same amount but that the Steam Deck could do like 10 times more gaming was something that really held me back from recommending it. And to be perfectly clear, at a $400 price point, I still think the Steam Deck is the way to go because it opens up the whole world of PC gaming. You have so many other games that you can play at that point. But the world, according to the Razer Edge, has changed because nowadays you can find it for $250 regularly, and often you will find it for sale for $200 instead. And so now that the device is effectively almost half the price of what it was at launch, that puts it in a whole new category for me. In fact, even at $250, I can see it sliding into the world of retro handhelds at that price point and performance. We'll talk about that near the end of the video. And I should also mention that there are two models of the Razer Edge. There's a Wi-Fi and 5G model. We're only talking about the Wi-Fi model. The 5G one is still $600, and I think that is definitely not worth it. Yes, 5G connectivity is pretty awesome, and it does give you an additional 2 gigs of RAM, 8 instead of 6, but I think that that price point is definitely not worth it. Now, before I jump too far far into the price and whether or not it's worth it, let's ratchet it back a little bit and talk about some of the updates we've seen over the past 18 months. To start, we have a new update when it comes to the microSD card. Previously, it only supported FAT32 formatted cards. Nowadays, it supports exFAT, which is a better standard because it allows for larger file sizes. And so this was just something that came in a software update over time, and so I'm very happy with that. I've also heard that they've updated the read and write speeds of the SD card, which should allow you to have a little bit less glitching and stuttering when playing games. In addition, the standard software that they use, which is called the Nexus app, actually has had quite a few updates as well. Now, personally, I don't really use it that much, but you can set it up to launch, your emulators and games as you would like. But they've made some handy updates into the settings, including an auto X input mode. When you have this turned on, it should detect whether or not the game supports X input mode and then use that. It's going to give you a wider range of compatibility. Now, I haven't played a ton of Android games, but as far as I can tell, just about everything has worked so far. I haven't had any games that don't work at all. And also bear in mind that any games that don't support any sort of controller input, there's still a key mapping mechanism like they had in my original review. Another update that's really handy is you can now adjust the haptic strength. I always found it to be a little bit on the strong side, and now I can set it down to low, and that's been perfect for me. Another thing I've noticed is it seems to be that they've fixed the power drain when it comes to actually putting this in sleep mode. When I first did my review, if I put it into sleep and then left it overnight, it would lose like 30% battery overnight. Nowadays, it only loses about 3 or 4%, and so they've done something to fix that as well. Now, in addition to the updates from Razer themselves, there have been just a lot of updates to Android in general, and so the perspective is a little bit different nowadays. Probably one of the easiest examples is going to be Nintendo Switch emulation. At the time of making my review, we had Skyline, which was pretty good, but I've always found that Yuzu worked a lot better, and this, of course, launched after the Razer Edge. Now, unfortunately, the Yuzu emulator was taken offline about 6 months ago at this point. There have been a bunch of forks brought up since then, but none have really taken up the mantle like that one. And even then, the last release of Yuzu back in March is still pretty good. In fact, most games will still play pretty well. It's just that we're not really seeing a unified development update since then. Now, another update that's happened within the whole Android world that's really enhanced the Razer Edge has been that we have now third-party driver support. And these were also available at the time of the Razer Edge launch, but they're a lot more performant and compatible nowadays. Not only that, there are quite a few emulators that will take advantage of these updated drivers, including the Yuzu one we were just talking about, but then also 3DS and then Dolphin for GameCube and Wii, and then also PS Vita too. And so these driver updates have helped to enhance compatibility and performance with those systems as well. And then finally, we've had the release of Emulation Station Desktop Edition for Android, and this has really transformed my overall experience with this device and basically any other Android handheld as well. This allows me to have a very seamless experience when it comes to navigating through my games, and I can tailor it however I would want because there are a bunch of different themes too. For example, this one is called Canvas, and I think it's really great. It allows me to navigate through both vertically and horizontally, and then of course I can choose my game and launch them from here as well. In addition, we've got some fancy features. For example, it'll play a video preview as you hover over the game, and also anytime we're in the main menu, I can press the X button to bring up a screensaver, which is going to play those video snapshots as well. And I can press the right button on the D-pad to toggle between the different games, and when I find one that I want to play, I can press the A button and it'll actually launch it as well. Not only that, you can change the look and feel by using different themes. So in addition to the Canvas one, we can try out quite a few others. One of my favorites is this one called Artbook Next, and it'll allow me to navigate through just in the same way, but with a little bit different of a design. I also like this one. It's called Electful NX and just has a really nice interface to it. And so I think these three things combined, Nintendo Switch emulation, third-party drivers, and then also just a new interface when it comes to Emulation Station, have really enhanced the user experience, but then also just the value of the Razer Edge on its own. And when you combine it with the fact that it's about half the price as it was back then, it becomes a much more viable option. Now, in addition to all the software things that we just talked about, there are a couple hardware mods that I've done and seen around the community that I think are worth investigating as well. Now, a couple of these are like super simple mods, like putting a screen protector on. They actually have one made for the Razer Edge. It's about $8 on Amazon. I think that's worth it so you can protect your device. Another hardware addition I've done with the Razer Edge is this little kickstand. This cost me, I think, maybe $10 altogether, and they're made for cell phones. You may have seen them before. And you connect this to the device using an adhesive, so you can just pull it right off if you don't like it. But the idea here is that you can use it both in handheld modes. You could use it as a kickstand like this. And so while I'm not sure you would have a use case where you would be playing it like this, it's still kind of nice to be able to prop it up if you want. However, a big draw about this device is that it is also a tablet. So I could just take it right out of the controller and just use it on its own like an Android tablet. tablet. And this is where that kickstand becomes really handy, because now you can actually just use it propped up to view media if you'd like. And so this has been an unexpected benefit for me, is using this as like a little media tablet. For example, if I was going to be going on a plane and I wanted to watch some movies, I could just use this. And so it's kind of like an alternative to your phone. If you don't want to drain that battery, you can just drain this one, and it's got 5,000 milliamp hours. In addition, this USB-C port is capable of video out. So if you wanted to plug this into like X-Real glasses, you could do that as well. And so this little kickstand has transformed the way I think about the Razer Edge. Instead of just thinking about it like a gaming handheld, it actually can be used like a mini iPad mini. And so there have been times I've been able to load this up with Netflix movies and then hand it over to one of my kids when we're on a plane, and that has been really handy. And using this device in tablet mode really changed my perspective about the whole thing. Instead of thinking of it like a handheld that was a little bit clunky because of the snap-on controller, I started thinking about it like a phone that costs only $200, $250. And it's a really tiny shift. Instead of thinking about it as a product on its own, I really started thinking about it like a tablet that had other accessories. And once I started thinking about the Razer Kishi as an accessory, which it totally is, I started thinking about, well, I could use other accessories with it as well. And that, as you can imagine, started me down an entire rabbit hole when it comes to telescopic controllers and what would work with the Razer Edge tablet. And so over the past month or so, I've been trying out a bunch of different controllers just to see which ones work the best. And so I want to report those findings to you. It's kind of like mini controller reviews in the middle of this Razer Edge review. Now, before we even jump into that, I do want to just mention my perspective on this as well, and that these are all an added bonus. So for example, the Razer Edge on its own is just fine. These are all going to be something that enhances the experience and all totally optional. So I don't think that the Razer Edge needs any of these controllers, but it can totally change the look and feel of it as well. In fact, that's probably one of the more interesting things about the Razer Edge, is that you can actually change how the handheld looks and feels. If you think about any other handheld, you can do a couple things like maybe throwing a case on it or some grips, but other than that, it is what it is. Whereas with the Razer Edge, you can kind of turn it into whatever suits you the best. And that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about these controllers, because every person is a little bit different, and so one of these might fit you better than the other. And if things go well, you might be able to get an experience that is much better than the standard Razer Edge. Okay, as a baseline, we'll start with the Razer Kishi V2 that comes with the Razer Edge. And the way I would characterize this controller is that it is good enough, and it definitely gets the job done. There's nothing inherently wrong with this controller. In fact, there are quite a few things that I really like. Probably the best thing about them are these triggers. They've got a full analog input to them, and they feel very good. Just the perfect amount of resistance, and they are a good size as well. A little bit on the small side, but I think they're still pretty great. The face buttons are also pretty good. They are micro switch, so nice and clicky, but then they're glossy and also have a little bit of a rounded edge to them. So they're very easy to press down on. I have no complaints about them. The D-pad is also very similarly clicky, and so if you like a clicky D-pad, this is just fine. Now, the analog sticks are probably the weak point here. They do leave a lot to be desired. They are essentially Nintendo Switch Joy-Con sticks, so they will get the job done, just like this controller will, but I would rather use something that has a little bit more range of motion. When you put it all together, this controller works just fine, but it also feels a little bit on the cramped side. And a lot of this has to do with the overall just flat, straight design. For example, when using face buttons with the analog stick, your thumb is going to rest over the stick, and that can be pretty annoying. In addition, gripping the device is a little bit awkward just because it's so small, and so you have this big space between your middle and ring finger. Not only that, it does feel a little bit on the wobbly side, especially after 18 months of use. And so that's a quick baseline of the Razer Kishi. It's definitely going to work, and if you pick up this device for around $200, $250, I think that's still a great value. But one of the cool things about it is that you can enhance that if you would like. So let's look at some of these other options. Now, one of the first options I thought of is this one. It's called the GameSir X2S. This is a very sturdy controller, as you can see by just having a big block right here. However, one thing to note is it does not fit with this controller unless you make some modifications to make it wider. For example, you could remove this rubber bumper right here, and as I showed in my X2S video, you can also pull this and extend it beyond where it allows, and so it'll work that way as well. In fact, the reason why this controller no longer closes all the way is because I've done that too many times. I've overextended it. So I think this is a good option if you want something sturdy and you don't mind kind of messing around with it, but I think there are better options out there, so let's move on. Okay, up next we have something that's very similar to the Razer Kishi V2. So this is the ROG TESSEN from Asus. And I've had this for a couple months at this point, and I've used it quite frequently. Now, I think the best way to characterize this controller is that it is basically an upgraded version of the Kishi. The first thing worth noting are the upgraded ergonomics. It has these flared corners, which makes it a lot more ergonomic to hold, and you don't have your thumb getting in the way of the analog stick either. Speaking of which, that's probably one of the bigger upgrades are these analog sticks. They're not super huge, they're like smaller versions of console-sized ones. But the nice thing is they have a big concave dip in the center, which makes it really easy to hold your thumb. But then also it's got a huge range of motion considering the size of the controller. And so in general, if you do plan on playing a lot of analog stick-centric games, this is a big upgrade right here. Now these face buttons are also pretty good. They have a matte texture to them, and they are also clicky, like micro switch or dome switch, and they are a little bit more resistant than the Razer Kishi ones, so they do take a little bit more force, but not much. The D-pad here is also very similar. It's also clicky and takes a little bit of force, but I think it is very comfortable. Now these bumpers and triggers I think are a lot better. The bumpers themselves just take a little bit of force to press down on, and then these triggers are also analog, but a lot bigger too. The other thing I like about them is that they're so curved that it's like a perfect placement for my index fingers, and so I find these to be really comfortable. Now we have two programmable back buttons here, and these are made out of metal, and they're actually pretty solid feeling, and they're pretty easy to press down on as well. But I will admit that I wish that you could take these off, because sometimes I just don't really need these buttons here, and I do press them accidentally. But admittedly, over time, I got used to just resting my middle finger on it, and yeah, sometimes I would press down on it, but it just wouldn't do anything because I wouldn't program anything in. The other claim to fame of the Tessen is that it actually breaks down, so you can do this. I'm not really sure why you would want to break down a controller into this shape in particular. I don't think it actually saves you any space, but it is just one of these weird gimmicks that it has. And so depending on how you're holding it and how you want to carry it, yes, you can break this down for better or for worse. Now, one thing that is pretty handy is they give you a bunch of different inserts that allow you to use it with various different phones as well as cases. Even the little sender pad right here has an alternative, so if you want to use something a little bit thinner to account for a thicker phone, then you can do that as well. And so this is handy. In addition to using it with the Razer Edge, you could also use this with a phone with a case. And that's probably one of the benefits of getting an upgraded controller like this, is that you don't just have to use it with the Razer Edge, you can use it with whatever phone you have as well. But of course, bear in mind, you can also do that with the standard Razer Edge controller too. Now, as you can see, once you have it hooked up, it actually gives you RGB lighting around the edges, and you can modify this using the Asus app as well. In addition, it does have pass-through fast charging at 18 watts. Another nice thing is that the entire design is very similar to the Razer Edge, and so it works with my kickstand no problem. Now, in terms of ergonomics, it has the same thing with most other telescopic controllers in that you have this big band right here. But one of the things I noticed about this one in particular is that this space right here is perfect for my ring finger. So I'm able to hold it just like this and kind of have everything fit nicely in place. And thanks to the ergonomic shape, it does feel a lot more comfortable to hold, especially when trying to access the D-pad. This seems to be a more D-pad-centric controller. And so after a while using the Tessen, especially with the Razer Edge, I've come away with one big impression, and that is that this is an excellent phone or tablet controller like this if you want something that's compact but still very comfortable. For example, I found it to be an excellent fit with both PlayStation Portable and Nintendo Switch gameplay. And I think some of this has to do with the fact that these two consoles in particular are relatively compact on their own. And so in playing PSP or Switch games with the ROG Tessen, I've just found it to be a very good fit in terms of the overall spirit of the console it's emulating. And so in particular, if you are looking to focus on a more compact experience, not having a device that's super large, then I think the ROG Tessen is something worth considering. However, keep in mind the price point. This thing is $110 right now, which I think is relatively high considering the fact that this is just an upgrade from the controller that's already on the Razer Edge. And so while I would consider it to be better in every way over the original Razer Kishi V2, I don't think it's $110 better. So if anything, I would say this is a pretty great phone controller, and whether or not you want to use it with the Razer Edge is going to be totally up to you. Now, one controller upgrade I can easily recommend over the standard Razer Kishi is this one here, the GameSir G8. And I've done a full video about this one already, and so I'm not going to dive too far into the details, but I do want to mention that this one is super sturdy. You can see it has that huge back on it, and it also is very much so like an Xbox controller. These triggers and bumpers are almost identical to an Xbox Series controller. In addition, the analog sticks and the face buttons are large and easy to use, and the face buttons are rubber membrane too, so they feel super classic and nice. The D-pad also has the traditional cross style to it, but it is clicky, although I still think it is a very good D-pad too. Not only that, it's got a headphone jack, which I think is super handy. By the way, the Tessen does not have one. And it's also got these big ergonomic grips that just make you feel like you're holding a console controller altogether. And I found a couple great use cases for this controller as well with the Razer Edge. For example, when playing PS2 games in widescreen, it just seems to be a really good fit. And I think it's because this controller does remind me of an old PS2 controller a little bit. In addition, when it comes to playing more modern Android games as well as game streaming, I found it to be a great fit as well. And it's quite a bit cheaper than the others. It's $80, which I think is well worth it, especially considering the fact that it's excellent with phones as well. In fact, over the past 6 months or so that I've been using this controller, the only thing that I haven't liked about it are these back buttons, because I will hit these bumpers from time to time. And this really could be just a rust problem because I do this with all the controllers, but it is one of those things where I've just turned it off and so that I don't actually actuate anything when I'm using these buttons. But other than that, I can't say enough good things about this controller, and I do think it is a really great fit with the Razer Edge, and I'll leave the full review linked down below. Now, even though I think the GameSir G8 is probably my best recommendation among all of these different controller upgrades, there is one that is worth considering if you want to go the full Monty. And by that I mean if you want the Razer Edge experience to be the best that it can be, no matter the cost or even the size of the overall controller. And in this example, we're going to talk about another Razer product. This is the Ultra. Now, this thing came out about 3 months ago, and I picked it up right when it launched, but I just really haven't had an excuse to use it. And it turns out that the Razer Edge was that perfect opportunity to kind of put these two together. So let's start by talking about the face buttons, which are kind of a massive size. They're super big, they're glossy, and they feel really great. They're a mix between like rubber membrane, but also clicky. I've never really felt anything like it. Apparently, a lot of Razer controllers nowadays use a very similar setup, and I'm here for it. I think it's really good. There's no wiggle or anything. Yeah, these are really good buttons. The analog sticks are also amazing. They are like full size. They remind me of an Xbox controllers. Yeah, these are really good as well. In fact, when playing something like Super Mario 64 with these analog sticks, I kind of feel like a superhero, like I have an entire range of motion that you normally will not find on the handheld. On the left side, we've got a dome or shield style D-pad. I think this is also pretty good. It is very clicky, but rotates very well. Now, the thing about these circular D-pads is that they often will not pass the contra test, in that when I press down on them, I can wiggle it back and forth very easily. But with a clicky D-pad like this, it's not a big deal because you'll feel just a little bit of resistance before you click it, and so you'll never get an accidental diagonal. And so although this D-pad is probably not the best for like traditional retro gaming, it is really good in most other cases. And considering the fact that with the Razer Edge, I don't really like playing retro games anyway because 4x3 content looks so ridiculous that it hasn't been an issue with me at all. Now, these shoulders and triggers are also very good. We've got clicky shoulders and pretty big sized triggers as well, and yes, they are an analog input. I would say that I prefer the GameSir triggers over these ones, but I'm also a huge fan of that Xbox controller, which they're modeled after. And regardless, I still think they are very good triggers anyway. Now, the Razer Ultra also comes with a bunch of different rubber pads, or cushions as they call them, and so this will allow you to use it with a phone with a case and various different phones as well. And so in addition to using it with the Razer Edge, this will work great with just about anything else you have. Now, these grips are pretty interesting as well. They are massive, as you can see, and very, very comfortable. A lot of your weight is going to go right here on the palm grip, and it just feels very good. And so just in general, in terms of overall feel and having a very luxurious kind of experience, then I do think the Razer Ultra is definitely better than all the others, including the G8. But the big differentiating factor is this thing is expensive. It's $150, so almost twice the amount of the G8. And again, I don't see this as being a $70 upgrade over the G8. It is wonderful, but not that wonderful. It's also a little bit challenging to recommend specifically for the Razer Edge, considering that is between $200 and $250 right now. So it is hard to say that you need to buy a controller that almost costs the same amount just to get a better experience. However, I do want to be honest in the fact that this really does enhance the overall experience. And even though, yes, it cost me $150 to get this experience on top of the Razer Edge, I think it was well worth it. And so for most of the testing that I've done over the past month or so, it's been the Razer Ultra that I've enjoyed the most, and so this is my preferred controller, even though I would recommend the G8 just because it's a lot cheaper. But if this is within your budget, and you do plan on using it with a phone or even a tablet, more on that in a second, then I do think that it is probably worth considering. So let's talk about tablets for a second. This is called the Aldo Cube iPlay 50. And as you can see, this is an Android-based tablet. It has a Helio G99 inside of it, which is the same chip that I tested just last week on the A1 Unicorn. Long story short, this little tablet is capable of playing most GameCube and PS2 games, and of course everything below it. Now, the main reason why I picked this up actually has nothing to do with that, but the fact that it's about the same size as an iPad mini. But this one is only $150 compared to the $500 iPad mini lowest spec model. And so this was an easy choice for me in that I wanted to test with a small tablet that was around the same size, and this was a lot cheaper. And so the big thing I wanted to demonstrate here is that yes, the Razer Ultra will work just fine with smaller tablets. In fact, I've got quite a bit of room to spare. And another thing worth noting is that the Razer Ultra also has some nice RGB lighting on it, and you can also customize this within the Nexus app. And so all things considered, it's a little bit complicated, but essentially I can appreciate how good the Razer Ultra is, but it is not something that I would recommend specifically for the Razer Edge if that's your only use case, just given the fact that it's $150. However, if you do plan on using it with a phone or a tablet, it makes a lot more sense. And another thing worth noting is that you can actually use this as just a regular Windows controller as well. You just plug the USB-C port into your computer, and then you can just use this as like a full-on controller. It's definitely a lot wider than a typical like Xbox controller, but if you don't have any other controller, this will always work in a pinch. And I'm always happy to see a headphone jack, so I'm glad they kept that in as well. And so the way I see it, if you are looking for a controller that can be used in a bunch of different use cases, not only the Razer Edge, but with your phone and a tablet, or just a controller on its own, it is worth considering, but bear in mind that it is going to be quite large altogether. And to give you an idea of just how large it makes the overall Razer Edge experience, it's about the same size as a Steam Deck, if you can believe it. And so if you do find the Steam Deck to be uncomfortably wide, this is not going to change anything with the Razer Ultra, with the Razer Edge. But for me personally, I don't really mind it. I like the size of the Steam Deck, and so I do also like the Razer Ultra size. And so yes, in rounding up these controllers here, my biggest recommendation would be to go with the GameSir G8. I think that is just a decent controller all around, and well worth $80, even if you're only going to use it with the Razer Edge. Meanwhile, if you want an upgrade that's still very compact, I think that the ROG TESSEN is worth considering, but it is quite expensive at $110. And then finally, if you want the best of the best and things like size and price are not a huge concern, then yeah, the Razer Ultra is pretty amazing. To give you an idea of how this all kind of fell out, one of the main games that I've been testing with is Call of Duty Warzone. Thankfully, this game works just fine on the Razer Edge with various controllers, which is awesome. And I found that playing this game with the GameSir G8 has been enjoyable. It is super awesome to basically be playing with an Xbox controller right there in your hands. However, between the two, I have definitely been preferring the Ultra over the G8. And a big part of that has to do with the thumbsticks, which are just silky smooth, and so that has really enhanced my gameplay with this game in particular. Either way, long story short, if you are looking at upgrading the Razer Edge experience, for example, you already own one, or you're thinking about picking one up when it's on sale, I do think it is in your best interest to also consider a controller, and among all the other options, I think the G8 is probably the way I would go. Okay, for the next segment, I want to jump into performance testing, and the idea here is I'm just going to do a recap of the results over the past month to give you an idea of what the Razer Edge is like in terms of performance right now. So when it comes to low-end gaming, I'm not really going to focus on that as much, just because, like I mentioned before, the aspect ratio is just a little bit wonky with the Razer Edge, and so I have not preferred to play retro games on this device. But suffice to say, all of these are going to play absolutely fine. I would say that the system that I found to be the most tolerable among the retro systems is Game Boy Advance, because it's a little bit wider. It's 3:2 aspect ratio. So I can definitely see myself playing this system in particular on the device, but not really anything in 4:3 below that. Now, thankfully, once we go up a couple generations and get to more 3D based systems, then we can use widescreen cheats and hacks. And so a lot of systems like PlayStation 1 and Dreamcast and even Nintendo 64 can all be pushed into a widescreen format using emulation hacks within RetroArch. And so when it came to retro gaming, this was kind of my early starting point right here. I really enjoyed messing around with these games and figuring out which ones work the best with widescreen hacks without any sort of issues. And I think there are a surprising amount of games from those three consoles in particular that work really well. And so if you do want to mess around with widescreen hacks, then I think that these three systems are a no-brainer. And these widescreen hacks are all running at 16:9, which I think looks just fine on the Razer Edge. It would have been even better if this device was 16:9, but we have what we have. Now, this might be surprising, but the most disappointing system for me was Sega Saturn, and it's not because of performance. In fact, using the Beetle Saturn core, I was able to play just about every single Saturn game no problem. So the performance is definitely there. The problem is that this doesn't really support widescreen hacks. And so as a result, you are going to have to contend with that 4:3 aspect ratio, which again, was just a little bit hard for me to stomach. Now, moving on, there are some handheld systems that really shine with the Razer Edge. The first among them will be the PSP, and like I mentioned, I prefer to play these with the ROG TESSEN. It just gave it a more compact feel, and I think the 16:9 aspect ratio game looks just fine on this wider screen. Another system that looks really good is the original Nintendo DS. Because these two screens are 4:3, when you put them side by side, you actually have room to basically make them full screen. And so if you are looking to play DS games side by side, then this will be a pretty great experience. It's very similar with the Nintendo 3DS, but the aspect ratios are a little bit different. I believe the top screen was 5:3, which means it's going to be wider. And so as a result, you're going to want to make that one bigger, and then the one on the right of it or the bottom screen a little bit smaller. And I think this setup looks really good, especially considering the fact that the bottom screen was not used very often in a lot of these games. And so it does allow you to focus front and center with the top screen experience while still having easy access to the touchscreen with the bottom screen on the right. Of note in terms of performance, just about every game played at a 3x resolution just fine. A couple others I had to drop down to a 2x, including Pokemon Sun, and same thing with Smash Brothers. But other than that, yeah, everything played mostly at a 3x resolution and it looked gorgeous on this AMOLED display. Okay, moving on to Gen 6, let's talk about Nintendo GameCube. Now, some of these games do work with widescreen hacks, but many will not. And so it will really depend on the game that you're trying to play, but from a performance standpoint, everything's going to play pretty well. For the most part, I've just put everything on a 3x resolution, which is going to be well above the 1080p resolution of the screen, and yes, performance would be just about perfect. For F-Zero GX, I did find that I had a better gameplay experience when bumping it down to a 2x resolution, but I think it still played really well and looked good. The only game that gave me a lot of trouble was Rogue Squadron 2. This one I played at a native aspect ratio, and even then I got some dips here and there. But this game is notoriously hard to play, especially on Android versions of Dolphin, and so I still think that overall the Dolphin experience was very good. And I think playing Nintendo Wii on Dolphin was a lot better experience than GameCube, because most of these games are just natively going to run in 16:9. And for the most part, I did play these games at a 2x resolution, which is not quite at 1080p, but very close. And so yes, Nintendo Wii was an excellent experience, and I think this was a little bit better than GameCube once you get all the controls locked in. Now, thankfully, a lot of the PlayStation 2 catalog, or at least the games that I really prefer to play, are more widescreen friendly. In fact, quite a few games already have a 16:9 aspect ratio option within the game settings, but then also you can apply widescreen hacks. And so I would say the majority of PS2 games can be played in widescreen, which is going to be a great fit with this device. In general, I chose to play everything at a 2.5x resolution, which is something you can set up within the NeitherSX settings, which is really handy. And that will generally be just a little bit above or below 1080p, so very close to it. Now, bear in mind, as performance got a little bit more demanding, I did have to drop down the resolution. So for games like Ratchet & Clank Going Commando, as well as God of War 2, I did play these at a 2x resolution instead. That's still going to be very close to 900p, so it's going to look excellent on this display. Surprisingly, the only game that I really had trouble with when it came to PS2 was Shadow of the Colossus. This one I had to play at a native resolution just to get a more consistent frame rate. So overall, I would say that yes, PS2 is definitely playable on this system, but you will have to do a little bit more settings tweaks compared to GameCube. Okay, and finally we have Nintendo Switch emulation. Like I mentioned before, emulation performance is basically halted on this. There's been a couple updates here and there, but nothing really widespread like it was before. But I would say the Yuzu app was pretty far along already, and because we can use those third-party drivers, it's actually a pretty great experience. Now to start, let's talk a little bit about that Razer Kishi controller that comes with the Edge first. And to be honest, if you want a fairly authentic experience to using a Nintendo Switch, this is going to be a pretty close example. Part of that has to do with the analog sticks, which are just basically the same as they are on a Switch, but then also the placement of the analog sticks will just get in your way, much like it does on the Switch as well. For my part, I did prefer to play these with the ROG TESSEN just because it was a lot more comfortable and ergonomic. Now, in terms of performance, I would say that most lightweight Nintendo Switch games are going to play fine as long as they're compatible with the emulator. Basically, all the way up to Super Mario 3D World, which is a bit on the lightweight of the 3D titles, this one works fine. Bear in mind that by default, I just put everything in handheld mode as opposed to docked mode, so there is a bit of a performance cut that I'm already making. And when it gets to games that are a little bit harder to run, those that have a lot of shader caching, for example, Super Mario Odyssey and Super Mario Wonder, these games will take a performance hit as those shaders start to compile. So the way I see it, when you first enter a level, you're going to get a lot of slowdown, but then by the time that you get to the end of the level, it usually will be playing at full speed. So this really is going to be beneficial when you're playing a game that has a lot of replayability. For example, with Super Mario Wonder, I like to replay these levels. It's a lot of fun. And so yes, that first one will be a little bit more wonky of an experience, but after that, I'll be able to play it at full speed. But just bear in mind that there are still performance issues at that higher end. Number one, we're having to use this in handheld mode, so the graphics aren't going to be as great. And there were quite a few games, especially those that ran in JIT as opposed to the native code environment, that did have a lot of slowdown. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe is a great example. This one would play fine for the most part, not quite at 60 frames per second, but I would still consider it to be playable. However, there would just be these long periods of stagnation where it would just freeze for a moment, and then maybe 5-10 seconds later, the game would pick back up. And when playing an intensive racing game like this, it gets a little bit annoying. So I would say when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation, there are better devices out there, But if you keep to lightweight and indie titles, you'll probably have a great time. Now moving on, let's talk a little bit about Android gaming, although I'm not going to spend a lot of time here just because it is such an easy and very boring thing to test. And that's because just about every Android game you throw at it is going to run just fine. The nice thing about most of these titles too is that they're going to scale to the native aspect ratio of the display. So you're going to get a very nice widescreen environment as you're playing these games. And so I think it's great. Personally, I'm not one to play a lot of Android games, but I did find this to be a very enjoyable experience. Just note that there are some games that will stick you in a 16:9 aspect ratio. For example, with Streets of Rage 4, they have these bezels on the left and right. And then a game like Vampire Survivors just kind of gives up on you and doesn't show anything on the far left or right side. It's just going to show it in 16:9. I don't think it's the end of the world, but something to be mindful of if you are going to be playing a lot of Android games. And finally, the other thing worth noting is that if you want to stream on this device, it's going to work out really well. Of course, it is going to be limited to that 16:9 aspect ratio, but I think it still looks great on this display like I mentioned before. So you will be able to do things like local game streaming from a PC or an Xbox or PlayStation, or you could also do cloud streaming as well. But for me personally, I don't see that as being a reason to buy a Razer Edge in the first place, especially considering that most people, especially those watching this video, have a smartphone which can do almost all that streaming anyway. So at that point, it's probably worth it to buy a cheap controller to do your game streaming as opposed to a $200 or $250 device. Okay, and so in wrapping up here, I'm not going to focus on my likes and dislikes like I did with my original review because they haven't really changed all that much. Instead, I want to talk about this device and my recommendations in the context of its price point and the overall market. So here's the way I see it. I'm just going to expect that this is going to be about $250 or cheaper going forward. And I think at that price point, considering the performance that we're getting, I think it is a very good value. We've got a device with an AMOLED display that can also just be used as a tablet for media consumption as well. In addition, I think it's a great handheld for certain systems like PlayStation Portable, Nintendo 3DS, and even PS2. Even just using it for Android games or as a lightweight Nintendo Switch console makes a lot of sense to me as well. So at this point, the big question becomes what else can you get around this price point or somewhere near it? And I think we should look at things that are cheaper and still very good and more expensive and a little bit better. And the first handheld that comes to mind is the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. This one's a little bit cheaper. It's $200 plus shipping, and it's not quite as performant, but still very close to the Razer Edge. For example, I'm comfortable in calling this one a GameCube and PS2 friendly device, and it can also play lightweight Nintendo Switch games. In addition, it's got a native 16:9 aspect ratio, which is going to make it better for obviously 16:9 content, but then also 4:3 content doesn't look quite as bad. Not only that, it's got the same 5,000 milliamp hour size battery, so it's going to give you some great battery life as well. And so if you are looking for something that's a little bit smaller and not quite as performant, but still very good, I think the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is an excellent value. But I think the use cases for these two are a little bit different because, for example, you can use the Razer Edge as a tablet, and then also it might be a better fit for Android gaming just because it has that wider aspect ratio, which is going to work with a lot of those Android games. In addition, I would say that on its own, the Razer Edge is more comfortable than the Retroid Pocket 4 just because it's a little bit more ergonomic. But then also you've got the added benefit of choice, of being able to change out the control scheme in case you want to get something better down the line. And so the way I see it, if you are in the market for an Android handheld and your budget is around the $200 to $250 price point, then yes, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro should definitely be part of that conversation. Now on the higher end of the spectrum, we have my darling right here. This is the AYN Odin 2 Pro. Now this one starts at $300, so it is quite a bit more expensive than the Razer Edge. And I also have the Pro model, which is $70 more than that, so $370 altogether in order to get the white colorway. Now the Odin 2 still remains my favorite Android device altogether. Part of that has to do with the fact that the performance is quite a bit better with this. It has the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. This means we'll be able to play things like PS2 and GameCube with no compromises. We can actually boost it up to a 3x or higher resolution no matter what. And it's going to be a lot better when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation as well, including the fact that I can play most games in docked mode, so they're going to look amazing on that 1080p display. In addition, it's got a bigger battery, 8,000 milliamp hours. There's just a lot of reasons why I really love the Odin 2. So when comparing the Razer Edge at $250 versus the Odin 2 at $300 or even $370, I still think that the Odin 2 is worth that additional price point. Instead, I think a better comparison would be with the Razer Edge in the full Monty version, which is going to be with the Razer Kishi Ultra. If you take $250 plus an additional $150 for that controller, you're now looking at $400, about the price point of the Odin 2 Pro. And I think that these two are a much more interesting comparison. To start, I would say that the Razer Ultra is a lot more comfortable than the Odin 2, especially when it comes to playing like first-person shooter games like Call of Duty Warzone. However, there is something to be said about the small, compact nature of the Odin 2 by comparison. In addition, I love having that additional performance power in that I can play just about everything I can throw at it. And in particular, I like using the Odin 2 with Nintendo Switch emulation, and so this is a better fit for me personally. But I could definitely see someone making the argument one way or another between these two, especially considering the fact that the Razer Kishi Ultra plus the Razer Edge are about the price of the retail Razer Edge a year and a half ago. And one other handheld worth mentioning is the AYN Odin 2 Mini. This is the upgraded version that came out from the Odin 2 about a few months ago. And the big draw with this one is that it's so small. So if you are looking for something that's just as powerful but way more compact, this might be part of your conversation as well. But really, when it comes down to it, I think the main question here is whether or not the Razer Edge is worth it, either with or without all of the additional accessories. And I guess the way I see it, that at $250, it is something that is worth considering if you plan on using it with the other strengths that it has over other handhelds. So for example, if you plan on using it in tablet mode, or you plan on using it with an additional controller down the line to really curate your experience, then the Razer Edge makes a lot of sense for me. And I think that performance-wise, it is pretty impressive for what you're getting at that price point. However, if you're really just looking for one dedicated handheld device that's Android-based, then I probably would just recommend the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro instead. It's going to save you a little bit of money, and the performance is pretty similar to what you can find on the Razer Edge. And Retroid also does sell grips if you want a more ergonomic experience. So long story short, yes, I do recommend the Razer Edge if you can find it between $200 and $250, provided that you are going to take advantage of those additional features. Because from a hardware perspective, there's a lot going on here. It's really just a matter of whether or not you're making the most informed decision that you can, and I hope that this video has helped you along the way. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you picking up a Razer Edge? Do you already have one? What do you think about this new price point and whether or not it's worth it? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.